Welcome to the second season of Coffee and Conflict, the National Security Institute's literary podcast, where I welcome leading experts to discuss their research, their books, and the most pressing defense and foreign policy issues of the day. I'm your host, Joshua Huminski, a senior fellow at NSI and senior vice president at the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress. So grab your first or second coffee of the day, and let's begin. I'm pleased to welcome Dr. Matthew Ford. He's Associate Professor in War Studies at the Swedish Defense University. He is the author of Weapon of Choice and co-author with Andrew Hoskins of Radical War. And he joins us today to discuss his newest book, War in the Smartphone Age, published by Hurst in London, a very fine publisher, if I may say so. Dr. Ford, welcome to Coffee and Conflict.
Pleased to be here, Joshua. It's great to finally meet you.
It's a delight to meet you. I read this book over the summer after picking it up in London, and I'm really excited to really dive into these questions. I really want to start, though, with a foundational perspective, if I may. Nearly all of us have smartphones. There's some 7.3 billion in the world today. But how do you define the smartphone age, and when did it really begin?
That's a nice opening question. I mean, I really think of this as the book as a history of the present, if you will. Because I'm trying to understand how we got to this point. And so your question about what this age is really nicely framed for me. I mean, some of it is about the technology itself and what's possible when the technology first came into being. Some of it is me thinking about how people live their lives as well. And clearly the smartphone has changed the way a lot of people live. I mean, I think not just a lot of, when I say a lot of people, I can't think of anyone who doesn't have a smartphone really in the West. All my students, even when I go and give a talk to the public or whatever, there's pretty much everyone. So, clearly, the smartphone, they've been around for a long time. When did they become properly popular? Maybe 2007-ish. But the ecosystem of apps and other associated technologies that come with it have only happened in the last, 10 years, maybe. Not really where it's become properly embedded. You do, everything from banking to buying a home to, shopping or whatever on your smartphone, and of course do all the social media stuff and take pictures and do video calls or whatever, So that's my kind of, in that respect, what's surprising, I think, is that because they're so mundane and ubiquitous, and people have kind of forgotten that history. The history of this particular technology is one that, for all sorts of reasons we don't even think about. This is what we have. This is how we do things. And I quite, when you cited my first book, Weapon of Choice, which is all about small arms, and I quite like doing work on sort of mundane technologies. People are so focused on the revolutionary stuff and the transformation stuff, but forget that how mundane things sort of interweave into everyday life and every part of our life, really. And so it doesn't seem actually that odd as a transition for me to write about small arms and a history of small arms with my first book, and a sort of history, if you will, of it's not just smartphones. It's about an age where we might think of smartphones as being the important technology that mediates our engagement with each other and the world. But, that doesn't seem very odd to me to go from guns to phones, as it were.
I want to stick with the technological aspect before really diving into the warfare component. Could you explain your concept of the stack and its implications for decision-making and operations in what are increasingly seeming as very technologically saturated environments?
Yeah. I mean, first of all, I should acknowledge that, there are other scholars who have coined the term, used the term in a particular way. I'm not using it in a IT sense of the word, as in, code going into the top of coding in and out of a particular platform or technology. I'm using it to refer to the relations, sort of the interfaces all the way down through cloud data centers, through that to the pipes and satellites that make it possible to broadcast, the gateways, but even as far as the cell phone masts and networks, down through ultimately, I guess, to the electricity grid and other bits and pieces that make it possible for us to communicate and transmit data. But as I said, some of the other scholars that have used it, people like Benjamin Bratton, they've defined it in slightly different ways to me. But in my mind, I think it's really what really constitutes the new a geography of war, and this is what we're fighting over. We're fighting over information flows, and how we're shutting down some information flows to some people so that we can gain information advantage whilst maintaining our own information flows so that we can legitimize particular conflicts amongst our population, or target particular individuals, or I think that this is the geography that we're actually fighting over, and it makes more sense to me to think about that in those terms rather than just in there's a line on a map and that's the front line. So if you think about it as a geography of war, it's important to sort of have a good understanding of or orientation around what it is that we're fighting over, and that's I guess the ambition behind both Radical War, which are with Andrew Hoskins, and my latest book, The War in the Smartphone Age, is to sort of orientate people around the everyday realities of how they're living, but in these circumstances, when it's transferred into a military or a wartime context. The stack is around us, and it helps us makes this call possible. But the question is, when you've then got on top of that layered into it something kinetic going on, something cybery going on, something information warfare going on, what's making it possible is this geography, the stack.
Sticking with that, because one of the things I think is quite amazing about the smartphone itself is how it's distributed and fundamentally changed the nature and relationships of people to devices to organizations to governments to companies and across the board. I mean, how does the smartphone age, in your mind, redistribute power and conflict? I mean, whether it's between states and non-state actors, militaries and civilians. I mean, even between soldiers and commanders. I mean, before the podcast began, we were discussing, the Strava incident, where we started finding out that there are these bases in very remote locations because you had data of soldiers running around effectively in a circle, and you'd see that's a little weird. Why is somebody doing a marathon in the middle of nowhere? And it turns out that there's a facility there. So, how has the stack and the emergence of the smartphone age redistributed power and conflict?
I think the first thing to remember is that the smartphone is a very simple device to use, but it's an enormously complex set of technologies that have all been pulled through into one very small, compact handheld device. Now it gives you access to planetary scale computational analysis capabilities. If you have ChatGPT on your phone, you effectively have access to a supercomputer. Your smartphone's a pretty smart device anyway, but through ChatGPT you can exercise this enormous set of complex technology. You can actually make use of those and access those in a way that I don't think there's never been that possible. There's never been that possibility before. So it seems odd that we shouldn't talk about it, because we kind of just take it for granted. And everyone has one. And so, everyone, it sort of becomes a great leveler, doesn't it? It's effectively a democratizing device. I mean, of course, it's not democratizing insofar as, the people and the businesses who develop the code, build the software, the apps and all the other ecosystems that go with it, they are shaping and helping mediate our lives. And in that respect, they have more capacity to shape what's going on than you or I may be. But the fact that you can repurpose those technologies, so, use WhatsApp not just to manage, have conversations with your friends and colleagues or whatever, but also so that you can film. I mean, this is what I know is going on from talking to friends of mine who are anthropologists. You have a phone soldier who's literally recording a soldier carrying an AK as they're going to battle in Somalia, and they're doing it, and they're live broadcasting that to a diaspora all over the world, because the diaspora want to know how their money's being spent when they're giving money to their clan or their village or their community or whatever, and they want to make sure that it's going to good use. And so that's just taking an ordinary app and just repurposing it for the purposes of amplifying or communicating propaganda, maybe, I don't know, or just asking people for support and remittances associated with keeping a particular community in the fight. I don't think the developers at WhatsApp necessarily thought about that when they came up with the app, but there you go. That's how people are repurposing these technologies, you know?
I want to stick with that example that you just brought up about the Somali individual with the AK-47, because there seems to be a risk of conflating the representation of war on social media with its material conduct. I mean, I'm reminded of the example of the first-person drone videos that we see coming out of Ukraine, which have an inherent self-selection bias and confirmation bias. You're only seeing the successes. I mean, so to what extent do you think that this visual saturation of war imagery online and videos from the front line are creating a distortive narrative, not just for the public and analysts, but also for policymakers themselves?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, the truth of the drone stuff is really hard to understand just from the mediation of it. You know, its representation online. You know, 2 million drones were 2 million, 3 million, several million drones were produced by Ukraine. You know, we don't have footage of every one of those drones, so we don't know what every one of those drones has done. We see footage of a particular subset of those drones where something has happened that the Ukrainians typically want us to see, and then we conclude from this bias in the selection bias that the drone is going to revolutionise how we fight. Well, yeah, I mean, I'm not saying that the drone has not changed a lot of things in terms of how we fight, but the representation of that is skewed in a particular way to reflect, the images that are broadcast rather than the stuff that's not. And that, has shaped debate, I think, and not necessarily in ways that, if you were doing old-fashioned operational research, you'd be welcoming. That said, I think that the broadcasting media is definitely, and through social media especially, is definitely shaping the conduct of war. People are organising the fight in a particular way so that it becomes broadcastable on social media. And then if you're really smart, you'll try and develop a communications strategy that plays into the way social media works, and that then takes on a life that is beyond the control of the platforms that ostensibly control the social media content, or governments who are trying to tell their own story or whatever. And we can see with Hamas that was a remarkably successful from their point of view. They understood that social media is participatory, and the way that they managed to get Israelis themselves to broadcast their own murder, that was a properly sophisticated media campaign, as far as I can see. And organising your military operation in order to maximise your chances of getting broadcast by people who were the victims of atrocity is even more genius. And I hate to put it like that, but that's the remarkable thing about what the strategy they put together for October in 2023. I think on the one hand, it's easy to get carried away here, and I hope that War and Smartphone Age doesn't sort of, over imply that the world has changed and that everything. I'm sort of being much more mundane and cautious about it than that, but I think it would also then be a mistake for me to suggest that everything's the same and we're experiencing the world like it was when we watched things on the telly only and didn't have social media and didn't have smartphones.
I want to come back to also your previous book, Radical War, which you also bring one of the theories from that book forward into War in the Smartphone Age, about the idea of participative war. And I think this follows nicely from the conversation we were just having about the blurring of lines between combatant and observer, of participant versus bystander. And I mean, how have smartphones really blurred this? And I think this is something that we've all come to experience, but we haven't really fully understood. I mean, by virtue of being on social media and seeing the FPV drone videos, set to new metal music, or seeing the live streamed videos, the horrors that came off of 7 October, and even prior to that, the Libya campaign, where you're watching individuals doing bomb damage assessment almost real time. So how has this changed for the line between warfare and not, for civilian and not?
Yeah, I mean, I think, when Andrew and I wrote Radical War, we, we had a good idea as to where we thought things were going, but there's nothing like a land war, a conventional land war in Europe in 2022 to make you think, how accurate is this book going to be? And I think the astonishing thing was that some of the core ideas around participative warfare and participative war sort of have held together. And I guess War in the Smartphone Age was me trying to push at that a little bit harder, just to see and think through the evidence that has come since we wrote Radical War, because we effectively finished that in 2021 when we finished writing. So I wanted to see how accurate we were in Radical War, and that's what inspired War in the Smartphone Age. And in particular, I wanted to focus not just on media and war, but also on the conduct of war and how digital connectivity is reshaping the conduct of war. And so, in that respect, I wanted to bring out how people's participation in the conduct of war was working. And, the really astonishing thing to me, when I first started to look at the war and the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February, March 22, was that the Ukrainians quickly released Evorog, the app on their smartphones to allow ordinary Ukrainians to record and upload imagery and other statistical useful geo intelligence to intelligence fusion cells that in Ukraine, so that then Ukrainians could triangulate, combine it, could fuse that bit of intelligence with other sources, and then use that to target Russians. So literally, a civilian watching a Russian column going down their village high street was taking a picture of it and then broadcasting it back to the fusion cells, and that would help actually in the fight. And of course, the result of that is that anyone with a smartphone becomes part of the targeting grid. Either you can do that unwittingly because you just become you're a data point on the grid, or you can be a willing participant by picking up your phone and actively recording something. And of course, from a combatant point of view, you become part of that. You are literally participating in the fight at that point, and then you become a target. So not only are you contributing to the targeting cycle, that you are actually on the grid yourself and potentially a victim of the other side. And in that respect, and one reason why we say that there's no such thing as a bystander is because even if you're not actively doing things, you're still on the grid. So in that respect, you're always going to be participating because everyone has a phone. So that kind of reflection, and then to see it actually, and then to find other examples of this stuff going on around the world, and you sort of go, hold on a bit, this isn't just something you could just brush off. I mean, you could say, well, people have always had phones and used them to report in enemy locations. But, the scale and speed at which we can do this, and then combine it and amplify those images so that they then go out onto social media, that's not been possible before, right? And, and to be sort of have it for everyone to have that capacity, I think is new and is worth reflecting on as new, without having to think, how revolutionary or transformative is it? It's a thing. And it's a thing that has resulted in civilians in Bucha, in Ukraine, getting murdered by Russians simply because they had phones in their hands, right? So I don't think I can put it any more blunt than that. We have to think about this.
I mean, how do you envision? I mean, it seems that we're in early days, and in some ways, this is sort of a technological update to an old paradigm, the role of civilians in warfare. But to your point, the speed, size, and scale of the impact and how they fit into these nodes and networks. But how does this involvement change the responsibilities of states, of militaries, of tech companies that are almost certainly sitting in Silicon Valley and saying, I'm not a participant in warfare, I just make a device. So how does this participatory warfare, change those responsibilities, or does it?
Yeah, I had a question from an Amazon executive when I started talking about this, and I said, well, they said, how will the laws of armed conflict protect us from being attacked? And I went, tough. You're the 21st century equivalent of a munitions worker in the Rhine, waiting for the RAF to come over. This is what you're doing. You are helping. You are effectively part of the complex of technologies that make fighting happen in particular kinds of ways. And don't be surprised then that if you also then find yourself getting targeted. And on the one hand, you go, well, that's just not right. But on the other, it's the logic of the way we're pushing at things in terms of datafication and making everything about data and putting all our lives online, everything about our life online. Inevitably then, people who are actually responsible for building the platforms, maintaining the technologies, and you become targets themselves, and that can't be a surprise. And I don't think there's much that can be done to stop that from happening, and possibly, nor should it, I mean, this is it's arguably, nor should it. I mean, this is the implication of what it is that we're doing. It says to me that's it's almost inevitable, right? It's part of, if you make all the profit, then there's risk,
Does that, I mean, sticking with that though, does that suggest that our concepts of warfare and the legalities and the structures around warfare need to be changed or need to be updated? I mean, is there a law of armed conflict for the Amazon Web Services and the open AIs of the world, or are we well short of that?
Yeah, I think the way these devices have reworked representation of the conduct of war implies that the legal frameworks that we have grown up and grown with and are used to are not fit for purpose. And then as I say that, I hear people at the International Committee of the Red Cross or international lawyers dispute no, we just need to, the law is behind, but can be put in place to catch up with, and it doesn't require an enormous rewrite. It just means being clear about what direct participation in war means, and the framework is already in place. You're not a combatant unless and until you actually pick up your phone, take a picture, but are also doing that with the intention of providing intelligence, and that is also connects directly back to someone at the other end, and you can trace a causal link to that person at the end who's pressing the button to shoot at something, and I mean, for all sorts of reasons, I'm sure they're right. But for all sorts of practical reasons, it feels like, it just feels too much to try and insist on. If you're, what do you have to do to your rules of engagement when you're doing a counterinsurgency operation under these circumstances? How are you going to win hearts and minds when everyone's taking a photo of you? And, okay, at what point does this turn kinetic? That ought to be a serious concern for those people in uniform who are going to be operating in an environment where, everyone's connected. And, you can say, well, we can try to control the network and switch on and off what's going on in a particular network. You're never going to switch the internet off. And the reason you're not going to do that is because everyone's lives are online. And if you want to switch off the world's economy, if you want to switch off a particular economy, you can switch the internet off, but it's going to cost you more. So I think we're stuck in that respect.
Taking the sort of illogical or perhaps illogical step forward on this, looking at the next phase of sort of technological evolution, we have almost hyper personalized targeting. We're talking about extremely fast kill webs of connecting sensors to shooters at a scale, speed, and pace that I don't think we've fully come yet to appreciate. And certainly in the Strategic Defense Review that the United Kingdom released, there was very much a heavy emphasis on. Obviously, they didn't call it the kill web. I forget what they call it, but that's what it
Yeah, yeah,
was.
yeah, yeah.
But how does the smartphone leap forward in this, and what are the consequences of this when you have sort of a ubiquitous facial recognition in urban environments, when you have ultra precision? I think it's like the R9X flying Ginsu Hellfire missile, for example, where you can have almost personalized targeting, but then at scale. And you'd write about this, I believe it's sort of the last chapter. I want to kind of tease out that sort of hyper war aspect you were talking about.
Yeah, I mean, on the one hand, it's hyper scary, isn't it? Even as you're saying that, I think anyone who has access and can control that technology will feel in a lot happier place. But anyone who's subject to that technology is not going to be in a happy place at all. And the problem is, and I mean, one of the problems I have, I think, with the idea that somehow AI will solve all of these problems is if everyone's a participant, then how would you tell who's the good participant from the bad participant? What do you actually do? How much data do you need to compile so that you can tell that I'm a good guy and you're a bad guy? If everyone's a participant, your red blue tags in terms of friend foe, they're kind of meaningless, right? And so it's a sort of, I find it almost like a category mistake. And I think that, that somehow more data will solve these essential problems because, we're participating. Everyone is participating. And, you can do that just by carrying a smartphone around you. You are part of the algorithm that works out pattern of life. And you're looking for oddities in that pattern of life, which you can then use as indicators for doing something. But, if everyone, it seems to me to be really hard conceptually to figure out how you might be able to pass all of that in a way that would allow me to understand, or allow a targeteer to understand the difference between friend and foe. I mean, short of already having a preconceived set of views about what friend or foe is, and then that just takes human input. That's not about data. That's about choice. So on the one hand, the technology promises a huge amount, but I think that there's sort of almost fundamental flaws in it, in the way people are conceptualizing it, because that's, the technology is not going to resolve how people live. And the source data that's being used in order to drive the technology. The source data is us. Yeah, it's not war or anything like that. I mean, it is, of course, but it's also us. We're the ones that are helping people understand, when to go about doing your targeting operation or not. When do people go to work in Washington, or, and you can say, well, it's always around between 7 and 9 or whatever. But, you've actually got the data points. You've got the data points. You might start trying to, pass particular, look for particular patterns. But as I said, if everyone's doing that, then what is it that you're going to use to distinguish? And I think that's where I see a lot of the problems. That said, clearly there's a lot of AI technologies that are in play. Some of these things are really obviously very helpful and useful. But I think we're always going to get to a point where the ambitions for the technology and the practical realities of making it work are just not in harmony. And what I worry about under those circumstances is that just when we need something to work, it'll fall over, and then we won't have the skills or the know-how because of just skills fade, and we won't have the people in place to do old jobs. And then actually we won't be able to do something. And we've become so dependent on a particular technology or platform that, goes wrong at the wrong time. The cloud falls over for 16 hours. AWS servers fall over for 16 hours. And then, what do? And just at the most important time, and we don't have the analog backfill capacity to make up for it.
It's certainly bad enough when AWS goes down and I can't mobile order my Starbucks, and that's not reliant That's not a
That's right.
defensive network relying on anything other than sort of my caffeine intake.
Yeah.
I want to stick with this because you raise an interesting point here about sort of the investment in technology and the return on that investment. I mean, from your perspective, I mean, has the age of the smartphone widened or narrowed the gap between technologically advanced militaries and irregular insurgent forces? And the chapter you have on the 7th of October, I think, is absolutely fascinating because, on the one hand, it was clearly a counterintelligence success for Hamas, with the atrocities, obviously, that it was. But it was also a singular failure of a reliance on technology in many ways. And can you talk about how both Israel and Hamas leveraged technology, or the technology failed them in both instances?
Yes. I mean, as that was unfolding, and as I was thinking about writing this book, I just realised that I'm actually going to have to do some proper campaign and figure this out, because to write a book about war in the last 3 years or so without mentioning it would be just ridiculous. So it was very, very painful to work out and work through, but fascinating to think through the strategy that Hamas adopted, some of the challenges that, some of the reasons that Israel might not have actually spotted what Hamas was up to, or and then how the campaign played out. And the thing is you could see it pretty much all on quite a lot of it on social media, which is even more remarkable, I think. And that was partly because of Hamas's strategy. That was its intention. But let's go back to the starting place. What's remarkable is that I think Israel is probably one of the, if not the most advanced armed forces in the world, and certainly one that understands how to maximize the use of technology, surveillance, AI, pattern recognition. I think that when it comes to armed forces that know how to get the best out of compute power, I think Israel's right up there, right? And yet that kind of didn't matter because a country, a terrorist organization that was on a 2G network that was under total surveillance by the Israelis. I mean, they're kept on a 2G network because you can't transmit. You can't use WhatsApp very easily on a 2G network. So there's nothing end-to-end encrypted. You can transmit, you can't use something like WhatsApp to have conversations. So even if you do use WhatsApp, then NSO Pegasus would allow you to hack someone's smartphone anyway, right? So, but you kept on a 2G network principally because it helps Israel maintain surveillance over Hamas in Gaza. So, and Hamas know this, and they have to plan everything really carefully and basically off the grid, which is even more remarkable when you think about it. And the way they planned their operation was to employ open source intelligence techniques to sort of find where they could maximize the terror in southern Israel, amongst southern Israel's communities, Israelis, but also to identify strong points and other things that they needed to knock out amongst the IDF. And I mean, crucial here, I think, getting over the smart wall, over the through the wall where you've got sentry towers and remote controlled 50 caliber machine guns and all of this other clever technology to keep watch over and keep watch over Gaza. That's the easy bit in many respects. The harder bit is to effectively buy enough time to go spread out across and deep into southern Israel so that you can commit atrocities. So the key thing here, it seemed to me, is to sort of attack the military grid, the military communications network, and leave open the civilian communications network. So on the one hand, on the eve of before they attacked, they switched over to Israeli SIM card technology so they could use the Israeli telecoms grid, cell phone grid. So they needed that to communicate. But they also needed to keep the civilian grid open so that Israelis could broadcast their own murder. And so if you can attack the way the military communicate, you can create more time. You can slow down IDF response time, and then you can spread out further into Israel, commit more atrocity. And I think that's a remarkable campaign strategy because there's no doubt in my mind it has fundamentally changed world politics. I mean, whatever side you are on the debate, it's completely changed things. The remarkable thing about this is that Israel had everything under surveillance, and yet they completely missed it. One reason you could say they completely missed it is that they got sort of technology tunnel vision. They trusted in the technology and in their surveillance capability more than they trusted the eyes of those analysts who were seeing things and going, "Excuse me, this is going on. Something we need to pay attention to." No, the technology says it's fine. If you sort of have all this sophisticated gear, you kind of believe that that's going to solve your problem. But if none of the stuff is actually being recorded into the technology in the first place, then you're not going to pick it up, right? And this over faith in the technology, I think, has become a source of weakness and something that other people, terrorist organizations, armed forces, they recognize that, and then they will work out how to exploit it, because no matter how sophisticated our technology is, humans are really clever at finding ways to screw things up for people. And, that's the heart of what good strategy making is. And, loath as I am to say it, Hamas had an amazing strategy for October 7th.
If we play this out going forward, I mean, a lot of the lessons that I drew from the book that you highlight in terms of Ukraine, in terms of the 7th of October, even going prior to that, and certainly in Libya and in Syria, the sample set seems to be, I guess, thankfully a little constrained because we haven't had that many conflicts. But as we play it forward to, say, a Republic of China, Taiwan crisis scenario, some of the lessons that are drawn from there seem to perhaps not necessarily apply or not necessarily have been applied successfully yet, thankfully, because obviously we're not in a conflict. But if you look at that, a conflict in the Indo-Pacific, what would a Taiwan crisis in your mind look like in the smartphone age, when it seems to be very heavy traditional Navy, Air Force assets, certainly from the United States, attempting to either deter or roll back PRC aggression against Taiwan? I mean, what does that look like in the smartphone age?
Yeah, it's a really good question because, in many ways, what I've been writing about is war amongst the people, in Rupert Smith terms, war amongst the people, where we're talking a land war, really. That's where I've been spending a lot of time, and that's where civilians and smartphones tend to hang out, right, on land. And it seems to me that, the sophisticated sensor technologies, the AIs, the various other things that might help you sharpen and speed up and accelerate how you identify and kill targets, works much more effectively on the sea and in the air, and in a land campaign where picking out targets from civilians is very challenging. These technologies, I think, become a lot harder to apply without a lot more concern. Now, you're right to pick on Taiwan because, there is no strategic depth there, as it were. It feels like, the invasion happens and it's over, right? And in that respect, you could say, well, there's not much opportunity for testing. My hypothesis is limited because, Taiwan's so small, so close to China, and the war will be over very quickly. But, it's still a very connected place. You take out the internet for a moment as you're trying to figure out how to isolate it informationally, retain information advantage, and then invade. But you're going to put the internet back on eventually, right? And the simple truth of the matter is that people are going to be recording all this stuff, and they are going to keep it and then broadcast it at some point, whether the Chinese authorities or whoever likes it or not, right? So, even when you turn something off so that you can take military advantage of that moment, you're still being recorded. And that will come back and haunt you in all sorts of ways that will, undermine your capacity to maintain the claim that you are politically legitimate in your endeavours to, occupy Taiwan. I mean, assuming that scenario unfolds like in that kind of way. So I still think there's lots of stuff in here. Not least, of course, if you wanted to add depth to your deterrent effect, then you would want to make sure that you could retain the capacity to broadcast online, irrespective of what the Chinese did. So an obvious thing to do is to sort of secure that communication grid so that things are always online, whatever the Chinese try to do. So I think it's the harder question for me, but I still think there's lots to take forwards that I think strategists, people thinking about this, they do need to reflect on, right? Forward deploy SIM cards, forward deploy cell phone grid, a cell phone grid or cell phone masts that can be put up quickly. Make sure you have Starlink receivers in various places. There's lots of things that would help maintain a degree of connectivity beyond whatever China tried to do in terms of switching the internet off.
Bringing this conversation, I think, full circle, one of the things that I'm continuing to come back to is, in your mind, is the nature of war fundamentally changing from a sort of the Clausewitzian ideal to something else, or is it merely the nature of warfare changing? Is this sort of a fundamental revolution in military affairs with including the actual objective of warfare, or is this merely just sort of a socio-technological evolution of the character of war?
So that's a good question. I think the important thing to take away here is the idea that there is a geography, a connected geography of war built. That idea of the stack. We need to build that into how and what we think about when it comes to where war is being conducted and for what purposes. The fight, it seems to me, is through and over the stack. And that's a very different way of looking at things compared to, physical geography, a city or a country or whatever. And I think if you buy that bit of the argument, and I hope that if people read the book, they get to that and go, I can see there's, a good point here. We need to take it on. Part of my work now is to really test and push at that hypothesis. How far do we think about can the stack apply as a conceptual framing for thinking about the wars in the Sahel and the Horn of Africa? And if it is, how does it work? And that's an empirical question for me, and one I think that we need to investigate and haven't so far. And I've just put in a research proposal to the ERC with some friends to do that. That is a piece of work that needs to be done because I think it would change our conceptual framing of a lot of things as we think about the overlay of the digital and kinetic in connected warfare in the 21st century. So I think at that point, maybe I'd feel more comfortable to sort of declare things have fundamentally changed. But, my gut feeling is that, that's where we're going. And I'd like to suggest that War and Smartphone Age is a sort of history of the present gives you the tools at least to start thinking about that or questioning conventional descriptions of how war is working.
If I can ask one final question, if you were given a chance to speak to Secretary of War Hegseth or the Secretary of State for Defense Healy in the United Kingdom, what would be the one thing you would want to leave with either of them about this book?
Some things cannot be cracked just by throwing data and money at them. And some of the essentials are, and remain, it seems to me, framed in terms of what humans think and understand in terms of the possibilities of strategy. We need to think about strategy more than we do about technology. And technology can't buy us out of poor strategic thinking. Repeatedly, it seems to me, Britain, the British Armed Forces, I just worry that in hoping that technology will solve our problems, we forget that we have to do good strategy. That's what I worry about.
Technology will not save us. Well, I think on that note, this brings our latest episode to a close. I want to thank you, Dr. Ford, for joining us today for an absolutely fantastic conversation. Thanks, as always, to Keelan Wolf, Claude Jennings, the entire NSI staff in helping produce today's episode. Coffee and Conflict is available on Spotify and other fine purveyors of podcasts. It will also be available on YouTube and NSI's webpage. Make sure to join us for our next episode in just 2 short weeks. As always, if you've liked what you've heard or saw, be sure to rate, review, and subscribe. And most importantly, pick up Dr. Ford's book, War in the Smartphone Age. So thank you very much, Dr. Ford.
Thanks for having me. It's been great.